From the International Base Horaah, the Institute for Dayanim in Jerusalem, Israel, from Rabbi Yosef Fleischman. This is the title is The Geulah, Waiting or Making, for Shemos 5784, issue number 588. The Geulah, Waiting or Making. Are we permitted to take actions to bring the Geulah closer? Why is the vision of the Valley of Dry Bones read on Pesach? Why were the Jews so fearful of following Moshe Rabbeinu out of Egypt? And why did they refuse to believe that the time for their redemption had come? What finally caused them to believe him? What happened in the first Exodus undertaken by Ephraim's descendants? Did they have any hope? What was their mistake? When were they eventually saved? And what lesson must we learn from their story? What is exile? An evil to end at all costs, or a beneficial process which must not end prematurely? Sources. The coming parshas describe the Egyptian exile and subsequent redemption, events that span over 210 years. What is exile? Why is it necessary, and how can it be ended? Egypt was a country-sized prison for its enslaved nation of Bnei Israel, but at one point the descendants of Ephraim broke away and escaped. They arrived in the Holy Land, but were killed by the Philistines. What exactly happened to them? Why did they meet such a fate? This story carries a spiritual message on which we will focus this week, as well as a practical message which will be discussed in this space next week, Be'ezras Hashem. Repercussions of a failed attempt. When Moshe Rabbeinu was charged with the mission to go to Egypt and set the Jewish people free, he told Hashem, "Behold, they will not believe me. They will not heed my voice, but they will say, the Lord has not appeared to you." Shemos 4:1. To this end, Hashem gave Moshe a series of signs to inspire their faith. Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer 48 writes that when Moshe appeared, the nation was afraid to believe him because they were still traumatized by the Bnei Ephraim's disastrous failed escape. The elders consulted with the eldest of them all, Serach bas Asher, who recognized that Moshe had said the code words her father had disclosed to her, words that include a double pay, which were indicative of the true Redeemer, the code Pekadati. At this point, and the people believed, and they heard, that the Lord had remembered the children of Israel, and that he saw their affliction, and they kneeled and prostrated. Shemos 4:31. Why didn't they believe Moshe? The Midrash in Shir Shirim Rabbah 20 writes, when he came and said to Israel, "During this month you will be redeemed," they said to him, "Moshe, our master, how will we be redeemed? Did the Holy One, blessed be he, not say to Abraham, they will enslave them and afflict them for 400 years? Bereshit 15:13. We have been enslaved for only 210 years. He said to them, since he desires your redemption, he does not look at your calculations, but rather he leaps over the mountains. He leaps over calculations and over terminuses and intercalations. And during this month you will be redeemed, as it is stated. This month is for you the beginning of the month. Shemos 12:2. While initially the exile was supposed to end later, Hashem calculated it in a way that would allow it to end earlier. The Pnei Yehoshua in Ksubos 111a explains that it was due to the extreme suffering that was inflicted on Bnei Israel. Had the Egyptians not tormented them, the exile would have ended at a later date. But the trauma from the Bnei Ephraim's fate did not heal when they left Egypt. It continued to haunt them in their journeys. Mechilta, the Rabbi Yishmael Bishalach, and other sources explain that Hashem didn't lead them to Eretz Yisrael through the Philistine lands because the bones of the 180,000 descendants of Shutelach, son of Ephraim, were still scattered over those parts. Another opinion counts them at 200,000. Another reason is because the war with Philistines might remind them of the traumatic death of that premature attempt, to the extent that they might turn around and go back to Egypt. The Torah's Chaim in Chulin 92a explains that the memory remained engraved in their national memory, even many years later. After the spies returned and told them about their findings in the Holy Land, the Bnei Yisrael were afraid of a prospective war with the Canaanites and said, "Let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt," Bamidbar 14:4. Later on, when the Canaanites initiated a war, this claim arose again, and some actually returned to Egypt. The Bnei Ephraim's failure also influenced forces outside of the Jewish nation. The Torah's Chaim writes that at the splitting of the sea, the Egyptian ministering angel prosecuted them, saying their 400 years had still not passed, and they had to return. The Chidah in Chomas Anach, Shemos 4, explains, this was how Pharaoh's advisors convinced him to chase Bnei Israel after they had left. Just as the Bnei Ephraim managed to get out but did not survive, they claimed, so too the rest of the nation. They are intended to be enslaved by another nation. Bnei Ephraim. What exactly happened to Bnei Ephraim? In Divrei Hayamim we find more details. And the sons of Ephraim, Shutelah, and Bered, and the men of Gat, the natives of the land, slew them because they came down to take their cattle. And Ephraim, their father, mourned for them many days. And his brothers came to console him in 7:20 through 22. The Gemara in Sanhedrin 92b explains that they mistakenly thought the exile had ended and left prematurely. Why they took the cattle will be discussed shortly. In Tehillim, King David warns us to learn a lesson from them and not repeat their mistake, criticizing them sharply, and they should not be as their forefathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation who did not prepare its heart and whose spirit was not faithful to God. The sons of Ephraim, armed archers, retreated on the day of battle. They did not keep the covenant of God, and they refused to follow his Torah. Tehillim 78, 8 through 10. Rashi there explains that they left Egypt forcefully before the end of the exile and trusted in their might and in their arrows. Ultimately, they retreated and fled on the day of battle. In Hoshea we find a prophecy directed to Bnei Ephraim, reminding them, Ephraim, as I saw Tyre, is planted in a dwelling place, but Ephraim is busy taking his children out to the slayer. In 9:13. Chazal explained this refers to the premature escape from Egypt, which led to Ephraim's descendants' death. Details. Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer in 48 provides additional details to this story. According to this midrash, the children of Ephraim, as descendants of Yosef the monarch, lived peacefully for most of their years in Egypt. After 180 years, one of his descendants, some identify as Yagon and others as Nun, father of Yoshua ben Nun, informed them that Hashem appeared to him and instructed him to lead the Jewish people out of Egypt. 200,000 descendants of Ephraim, strong warriors, left Egypt and their wives and children. The Egyptians chased after them and killed them. Midrash Shocher Tov points out that as descendants of Yosef they were not enslaved, but rather served in the Egyptian army as warriors, of which the pasuk writes, "I removed his shoulder from burdens, his hands were removed from the cauldron." Tehillim 81:7. The Midrashim, Chilta Rabbi Yishmael, Mechilta Rashbi, others cited by Rashi Shemos 15:14, gives us a glimpse into the international repercussions of this saga. They explain the pasuk, "People heard, they trembled, a shudder seized the inhabitants of Philistia," Shemos 15:14, as referring to the fear the residents of Gat had of the Bnei Yisrael's revenge for killing the sons of Ephraim. A matter of timing. Midrash Rabbah Shemos 20:11 writes that Bnei Ephraim left 30 years before Moshe appeared. However, according to Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, it seems they left 83 years earlier. The Taz, Divrei David Shemos 6 writes, it happened right after Ephraim's death. How do these dates settle the pasuk describing Ephraim's mourning for them? And Ephraim their father mourned for them many days, and his brothers came to console him. Divrei Yamim 1:7-22. The answer is that he saw prophetically what would happen to his descendants and mourned for them. This is also why he could not be comforted. They were actually still alive. Why did they miscalculate the exile? The Midrash in Shemos Rabbah 20:11 explains that the Bnei Ephraim knew, Hashem told Avraham Avinu, they would be enslaved for 400 years, the covenant between the parts, but they mistakenly began counting the years from then. Instead, they should have begun counting it from Yitzchak's birth, when Abraham's descendant began living in a land which was not their own. Since the Holy Land had not yet been given to him, Yitzchak is considered having lived in exile. Midrash Shemos 13:17 explains that Bnei Ephraim knew Hashem had promised Avraham Avinu, Bereshis 15:16, and the fourth generation will return here, and saw themselves as that fourth generation which permitted them to leave. The Rambam in Igeres Teiman adds that when the people saw the Bnei Ephraim's fate, the pasuk writes in Shemos 2:23, and they cried out, and their cry ascended to God from their labor. The Chizkuni explains this was after they saw the Redeemer had not arrived and heard of the Bnei Ephraim's fate, that they lost hope. Different factions among the Bnei Israel counted the years of exile in various ways. Some calculated it from Yaakov's descent to Egypt. Therefore, when Moshe arrived and informed them the exile was over, they didn't believe him, thinking they still had another 190 years. Others thought the 400 years counted only from onset of the actual slavery, 70 years after Yaakov arrives in Egypt. When Moshe appeared, they claimed there were still another 260 years of exile left until their redemption. The Chidah in Pnei David, Devarim 2:12, presents another calculation that led to the Bnei Ephraim's mistake. According to the Zohar, it appears in Zohar Chadash, Vayeshev 49a, the Egyptian exile was a punishment for selling Yosef. Therefore, it lasted for 210 years, 22 years that Yosef was without his father, times 10 tribes who sold him. Each one of the tribes who died in Egypt deducted 1 year from the exile. Since they were not part of the sale, Bnei Ephraim did not include themselves in the punishment, and therefore decided that they were permitted to leave. Their fatal mistake led to a devastating massacre. Why was their punishment so severe? The Maharal, Chedushei Agadah Sanhedrin 92b, explains that when the time they had calculated passed, they gave up hope, saying, "That's it, our bones will dry up." They lost hope of miraculous redemption and took their fate into their own hands, relying upon their own military prowess and training as soldiers. This is why they were killed. Since they gave up on the redemption, they were unworthy of being freed, and even after their death, they should not have been resurrected. One who gives up hope does not merit seeing the final redemption. This is why the miracle of dry bones was so supernatural, beyond a simple miraculous revival of the dead. Due to time, we'll have to stop it here for part 2.